On December 31, 1941, the new commander of the United States Pacific Fleet assumed his post. He didn't raise his flag on a grand battleship. Instead, he stood on the deck of a submarine, the USS Grayling, looking out over a harbor choked with the burned and sunken wreckage of American naval power. Yet just 5 months later, a heavily damaged American aircraft carrier limped into that exact same harbor. Experts estimated she needed months of repair. She was thrust back into combat in exactly 3 days. How does a fleet that Japan deliberately paralyzed regain its striking power before its main warships are even pulled from the mud? The devastating strike on December 7th was never meant to permanently destroy the United States Navy. For Tokyo's military planners, it was a coldly calculated tactical gamble. The objective was straightforward: neutralize the American Pacific Fleet just long enough to allow Japan to sweep across Southeast Asia unchecked. By removing the immediate threat of American battleships, Japanese forces could secure vital resources in the Dutch East Indies and fortify a massive defensive perimeter before the United States could physically respond. Looking at the smoking ruins of Battleship Row, that gamble appeared to have paid off flawlessly. The documented physical toll was staggering. 19 American warships were destroyed or heavily damaged. The pre-war backbone of the fleet, 8 heavily armored battleships, were crippled, sitting on the harbor floor or battered against their moorings. Over 2,400 lives were lost in a matter of hours. The Japanese High Command did not harbor illusions that they had wiped the entire American Navy off the map. They knew other ships remained in the Atlantic and on mainland shipyards, but they were confident they had shattered the active striking force in the Pacific, buying the crucial months they required.
However, the attack overlooked a critical distinction. There is a profound difference between neutralizing active warships and erasing a nation's foundational capacity to sustain and repair a fleet. The immediate challenge facing the American command was one of extreme operational triage. Amidst the oil slicks and twisted steel, they had to ruthlessly decide what to save, what to temporarily abandon to the mud, and how to immediately weaponize the surviving infrastructure.
The most urgent question was no longer how to fight a war with battleships, but how to launch a counteroffensive using exactly what the enemy had left behind. The smoke rolling over Ford Island obscured a profound strategic reality. While the world stared in shock at the capsized hull of the Oklahoma and the shattered, burning remains of the Arizona, the true foundation of American naval power in the Pacific remained virtually untouched. The Japanese strike force, focused entirely on eliminating the battleships, the undisputed kings of the sea in the rigid pre-war mindset, had bypassed the very circulatory system that kept those ships alive and fighting. The strike was designed to paralyze, but in its execution, it ignored the industrial organs required to heal the paralysis. Above ground, highly visible and completely exposed to the sky, sat the Pacific Fleet's absolute lifeblood. Spread across the massive tank farms of Pearl Harbor were roughly 4.5 million barrels of heavy fuel oil. These colossal storage tanks were packed to capacity, holding the concentrated energy required to project American naval power across millions of square miles of hostile ocean. As Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes decimated the warships in the harbor, they flew directly over these sprawling fuel reserves. They did not drop a single bomb on the tank farms. To an aviator seeking the glory of sinking a dreadnought, a static oil tank offered little prestige, but this was a catastrophic oversight. Had the strike force targeted those vulnerable, highly flammable containers, the resulting firestorm would not just have incinerated the base, it would have erased the fleet's operational reach.
Without that oil, any surviving American ships would have been forced to retreat thousands of miles back to the west coast of the United States, to San Diego or Bremerton, simply to refuel. Hawaii would have been reduced from a heavily armed forward operating base to an isolated, easily besieged island outpost, effectively handing the entire Central Pacific to Tokyo without a major naval engagement. The American fleet would have been tethered to the mainland, but the oil survived. Yet, fuel was only half of the logistical equation. Warships are not static fortresses. They are floating cities of high-pressure steam, complex electrical grids, and heavy artillery. They break down in peacetime, and they are torn apart in war. To maintain them requires an industrial complex of staggering proportions. As the fires raged on the water on the morning of December 7th, the sprawling Pearl Harbor Navy Yard adjacent to the docks stood fully intact. The Japanese had ignored the vast network of machine shops, the electrical repair facilities, the pipe fitting bays, the metal foundries, and the colossal heavy lift cranes. They bypassed the warehouses packed with spare parts, raw steel,
and specialized naval hardware. Most importantly, the Japanese bombers spared the dry docks. The ability to pull a massive warship out of the water is the most critical choke point in naval repair. Dry dock number 1, a massive concrete trench over 1,000 feet long, capable of holding the Navy's largest dreadnoughts, was entirely functional. So was the newly constructed dry dock number 2 and the specialized floating dry docks moored in the harbor. These were not glamorous targets, but their survival was invaluable. A dry dock cannot shoot back. A machine shop cannot launch fighter aircraft. Yet, these untouched industrial cathedrals were the exact mechanisms required to rebuild a shattered fleet. They were the forges where ruined steel could be cut away, where flooded bulkheads could be patched, and where broken ships could be brought back from the dead. The Japanese had successfully broken the American sword, but they had completely ignored the anvil and the hammer needed to forge a new one. The preservation of the base infrastructure provided the tools for a long war, but a base without a striking arm is merely a target waiting for a second wave. The Japanese plan relied heavily on wiping out the American capital ships, neutralizing the fleet's offensive capability. But naval warfare was undergoing a violent evolution, and by sheer coincidence, the vanguard of that evolution had slipped the net.
When the Japanese planes plunged through the clouds that Sunday morning, their secondary targets, the American aircraft carriers, were nowhere to be found. Not a single flight deck was anchored in Pearl Harbor. The exact whereabouts of these massive floating airfields fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire Pacific conflict. The USS Enterprise, under the command of Vice Admiral William Halsey, had been scheduled to return to Pearl Harbor on December 6th. She had been on a critical, highly classified mission, ferrying Marine Corps fighter planes to reinforce the remote outpost of Wake Island. However, a violent storm at sea had battered her escorts, delaying her arrival by 24 hours. That unpredictable weather delay saved the ship. When the bombs began to fall on Battleship Row, the Enterprise was safely out at sea, steaming toward a burning harbor she was too late to defend, but fully armed, fueled, and ready to fight. The USS Lexington was also far beyond the reach of Japanese torpedoes. She was navigating the open ocean, acting as a high-speed transport loaded with aircraft destined for the garrison at Midway Atoll. A third carrier, the USS Saratoga, had just completed a maintenance period and was safely moored thousands of miles to the east, sitting off the California coast near San Diego, waiting to embark her air wing and join the fight. And a fourth critical piece of the puzzle, the USS Yorktown, was not even in the Pacific theater.
She was heavily engaged in patrolling the cold, dangerous waters of the Atlantic, enforcing American neutrality against German U-boats. The Japanese intelligence network in Hawaii had carefully mapped the anchorages of the battleships, but it had failed to confirm the precise positions of these carriers before launching the strike. As a result, the Imperial Japanese Navy had successfully crushed the heavy, slow surface line, but they had inadvertently left America's most potent, mobile, and offensive weapons entirely intact. The carriers were out there, untethered from the burning battleships, representing a radically different kind of naval power. Look at the brutal arithmetic of the board state on the afternoon of December 7th. The United States Navy had lost the core of its traditional battle line, but it retained exactly what it needed to wage a modern, fast-paced, mechanized maritime war. It possessed millions of barrels of oil to range across the Pacific without relying on mainland supply lines. It held the heavy industrial capacity, the dry docks, and the machine shops required to execute massive structural repairs right on the front line. And it maintained a core of fast, elusive aircraft carriers capable of striking over the horizon and dictating the terms of engagement. The Japanese planners had focused so intently on the stationary warships anchored in the mud that they failed to sever the logistical and industrial arteries that sustained them. They executed a brilliantly coordinated tactical raid, crippling ships and killing thousands, but they committed a profound strategic oversight.
They left the machine of war completely operational. The raw materials for a massive counteroffensive were now sitting quietly behind the smoking ruins of the harbor. The sprawling dry docks were empty and waiting. The machine shops were fully powered. The oil tanks remained full to the brim. Out in the deep water, the surviving carriers were already desperately hunting for the vanished Japanese strike force, unaware that they were now the sole offensive shield for the Western Hemisphere. But an intact infrastructure and a handful of surviving carriers do not automatically constitute a functioning navy. The physical tools remained, but the organizational structure was shattered. The psychological shock of the attack had paralyzed the chain of command, leaving a terrified base bracing for an invasion that they believed could arrive at any moment.
The burning question was no longer what the Japanese had destroyed, but who would step into this graveyard, look past the burning hulls, and ruthlessly weaponize the surviving logistical assets to build a viable defense before the enemy returned. That task fell to a man who had not commanded a single ship on December 7th. On the final day of 1941, the United States Navy officially transferred command of the shattered Pacific Fleet. There was no grand ceremony on the teak deck of a flagship. The appropriate battleships were either sunk or crippled. Instead, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood on the cramped, oily deck of the submarine USS Grayling, a vessel chosen primarily because it was one of the few functional command platforms available in the harbor. He inherited an organization defined not by its offensive capability, but by the sheer scale of its devastation. Nimitz did not step into a functional headquarters, he stepped into a logistical nightmare.
The Japanese war machine was not pausing to admire its handiwork at Pearl Harbor. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces were executing a simultaneous, lightning-fast expansion. They were systematically dismantling Allied defenses in the Philippines, storming across the Malay Peninsula toward Singapore, capturing Wake Island, and driving deep into the Dutch East Indies to secure the vital oil reserves they needed to sustain their empire. The strategic map was collapsing by the hour.
The United States faced the very real threat that the vital communication and supply lines connecting Hawaii to Australia would be severed, isolating the South Pacific entirely. Nimitz was confronted with a paralyzing conflict of priorities, the emotional demand from a shocked nation, and the immediate instinct of many within the Navy was to focus entirely on the ruins of Battleship Row. The visual weight of the sunken dreadnoughts demanded a monumental salvage effort. However, Nimitz recognized a brutal reality. Focusing the limited, intact resources of Pearl Harbor on immediately raising heavily armored, fundamentally outdated warships would consume the base's industrial capacity for years. It would paralyze the Navy's ability to wage a modern war and leave the critical shipping lanes completely undefended against the rapidly advancing Japanese offensives.
He could not fight the Imperial Japanese Navy with ships resting in the mud, no matter how desperately the public wanted them avenged. The Admiral bypassed the emotional pull of the sunken fleet and implemented a ruthless, pragmatic, two-track strategy for recovery. This was not a plan built on sudden inspiration, but on the cold, calculated realization of what the Japanese had failed to destroy. The first track was immediate, rapid, and entirely operational. Nimitz ordered his commanders to stop looking at what they had lost and start weaponizing exactly what they had retained. This meant utilizing the surviving aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and the incoming Saratoga, as the absolute core of a new, mobile striking force. The intact fuel reserves and functional dry docks would be dedicated to keeping these few, precious carriers operational and supplied.
Nimitz deployed these carrier task forces immediately, ordering them to conduct hit-and-run raids against Japanese outposts across the Central and Southern Pacific. These were not decisive battles. They were desperate, high-risk tactical strikes designed to disrupt Japanese timetables, secure the vital supply lines to Australia, and demonstrate to a stunned world that the United States Navy was still a lethal, functioning entity. The second track was the grueling, long-term salvage operation. While the fast carriers bought the Navy time and space, Nimitz isolated the massive undertaking of resurrecting the sunken battleships into a parallel, separate effort. He did not personally oversee the physical repair of the ships, nor did he micromanage the engineering details. Instead, he established the priority. The salvage operations would proceed, but they would not drain the resources required to keep the active fleet fighting. The long-term track would rely on heavy engineering, sheer industrial willpower, and the expertise of specialized salvage units. The strategy was set. The fast carriers would hold the line, fighting a holding action across millions of square miles of ocean, while a dedicated army of engineers and divers descended into the toxic wreckage of Pearl Harbor to drag the heavy armor back from the dead. But drawing a two-track strategy on a map in a headquarters building was one thing. Executing it within the flooded, jagged, and highly dangerous confines of a shattered harbor was an entirely different reality. The theoretical plan was about to collide with the massive physical friction of underwater engineering. The physical friction of that underwater engineering began at the surface of the water itself. To look at the harbor in the early weeks of 1942 was to look at a stagnant, highly toxic industrial wasteland. A thick, heavy layer of viscous bunker fuel in some places up to 3 feet deep, coated the entire surface of the sprawling anchorage. It choked the shoreline, coated the surviving docks in thick black grease, and trapped the sunken wreckage in a suffocating blanket. The air was perpetually heavy with the sharp, acidic stench of raw petroleum, the acrid smoke from smoldering fires that took weeks to fully extinguish, and the grim, undeniable reality of organic decay. This was the hostile, poisoned environment handed directly to Captain Homer N. Wallen. A material officer of exceptional organizational skill and ruthless pragmatism, Wallen was appointed by the Naval Command to lead the newly formed Salvage Division. He was not handed a pristine engineering manual or a fully equipped recovery fleet for this monumental task. No navy in the history of modern warfare had ever attempted to resurrect an entire sunken battle line from the mud of a single harbor. Wallen was handed a ticking clock, a shattered infrastructure, and a direct order to clear the congested waterways so the base could function. His first, most immediate operational obstacle was simply getting a clear view of the underwater damage. You cannot repair structural steel that you cannot physically see, and in the oil-choked waters of Pearl Harbor, visibility was absolutely zero. Wallen systematically assembled a unique, improvised army of recovery. He combined highly trained United States Navy divers with specialized civilian contractors, heavily relying on the deep industrial expertise of the Pacific Bridge Company. This was a massive construction firm, originally hired in peacetime to build dry docks, whose civilian engineers possessed invaluable, specialized knowledge of underwater concrete pouring, heavy marine construction, and deep water salvage. This unprecedented fusion of military urgency and civilian industrial expertise became the driving engine of the Salvage Division. But the actual grueling physical labor fell entirely upon the men sealed inside heavy canvas diving suits and bolted into solid copper helmets. For the divers descending into the flooded wrecks of the sunken battleships, the war was not fought with rifles or anti-aircraft artillery. It was fought by touch, in absolute, crushing blackness. The moment a diver slipped beneath that thick layer of surface oil, all ambient light vanished completely. High-powered underwater flashlights were rendered entirely useless against the dense suspension of particulate, ash, and thick fuel. The divers had to navigate the jagged, torn interiors of shattered warships entirely by memory, spatial awareness, and feel. They crawled blindly through twisted steel corridors, meticulously maneuvering their heavy, restrictive air hoses and vital lifelines around razor-sharp shrapnel, collapsed heavy bulkheads, and thousands of tons of unexploded naval ordnance. Every single movement in the dark was a calculated risk against the friction of the wreckage. A severed air hose meant immediate suffocation. A snagged lifeline on a piece of warped armor plating meant being trapped in a steel tomb. They were working deep inside the flooded graves of their own fleet, mapping the massive torpedo holes and bomb craters with their bare hands, translating the invisible, chaotic destruction into precise mental diagrams that Wallen's engineers on the surface could use to formulate a structural plan. The sheer physical scale of the underwater chaos was vastly beyond anything the Navy had ever modeled or prepared for in peacetime damage control exercises. Once the divers successfully mapped the underwater wounds, the Salvage Division had to figure out how to stop the ocean from pouring continuously through them. You cannot simply attach heavy steel chains to a 30,000-ton dreadnought flooded with millions of gallons of seawater and forcefully pull it to the surface using cranes. The lost buoyancy had to be meticulously, mathematically restored, compartment by flooded compartment, displacing the water with air. This required an unprecedented campaign of heavy underwater construction. Wallen's engineering teams engaged in a relentless industrial war against the sea, using temporary, custom-built structures known as cofferdams. Up on the surface, working around the clock in the fully operational Navy Yard machine shops and expansive carpentry bays that the Japanese bombers had ignored, civilian and military workers constructed massive wooden and steel patches. These sections, some the size of small suburban houses and weighing tons, were heavily weighted with lead and lowered slowly into the black water by the surviving heavy-lift harbor cranes. Down below, the divers, still working entirely blind in the suffocating darkness, wrestled these massive, unwieldy structures into precise position over the jagged, torn torpedo holes ripped into the ship's heavy armor plating. They bolted the cofferdams directly into the surviving hull steel, desperately sealing the uneven edges with whatever flexible materials they could find: heavy canvas, thick rubber gaskets, traditional oakum, and even heavily greased mattresses salvaged from the barracks. But a wooden and canvas patch alone, no matter how tightly bolted, cannot withstand the crushing hydrostatic pressure of the ocean pushing against a flooded dreadnought. To achieve a true, impenetrable watertight seal, Wallin utilized a specialized technique borrowed directly from heavy civilian bridge construction. Through a network of long, specialized steel pipes lowered from barges, engineers pumped hundreds of tons of a specific mixture called treme concrete directly from the surface down into the flooded compartments. This specific type of heavy concrete was chemically designed to cure and harden completely underwater, molding itself perfectly to the twisted steel and permanently sealing the microscopic gaps between the wooden cofferdams and the ship's damaged hull. It was an agonizingly slow, precise process.
A single massive patch could take weeks to meticulously prepare, maneuver into position, and successfully seal. Only when the underwater concrete plugs had fully hardened to maximum strength could the salvage teams deploy their massive, high-capacity centrifugal pumps to begin drawing the millions of gallons of water out of the hull. But the very act of pumping out the water introduced a terrifying, invisible new threat to the salvage crews. As the water levels inside the newly sealed, darkened compartments began to drop, they exposed stagnant, fetid pools that had been festering in the dark for months. The natural decomposition of organic material, mixed with spilled battery acid, raw sewage, and stagnant seawater, chemically produced massive quantities of hydrogen sulfide gas. This gas was highly toxic, completely invisible, and highly explosive.
Salvage crews entering the newly pumped damp compartments to clear debris had to wear heavy, restrictive gas masks and carry specialized chemical detection equipment at all times. The atmosphere was a powder keg. A single stray spark from a dropped steel wrench or the arcing of a portable electrical tool could easily ignite the concentrated gas and blow the sealed compartment wide open, instantly flooding the ship again and killing anyone trapped inside. The salvage of the Pacific Fleet was not a triumphant, glorious raising of flags and playing of bands. It was a dark, toxic, grueling industrial slog, fought inch by inch in the suffocating depths of the harbor, where victory was measured strictly in inches of displaced water, tons of poured underwater concrete, and the safe return of the divers. Half a world away, deep inside the heavily guarded war rooms of Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy High Command continuously monitored the intelligence trickling out of the aftermath of their strike. They were acutely aware that the United States possessed a massive, unparalleled domestic industrial capacity, but they were deeply confident in a rigid strategic calculation regarding the massive friction of distance, time, and logistics. The Japanese military planners understood the brutal geography of the Pacific theater. The ocean is vast, unforgiving, and requires massive logistical chains to cross. They calculated mathematically that even if the United States could physically rebuild its shattered ships in mainland shipyards, projecting that heavy industrial power forward to Hawaii was a logistical impossibility in the short term. Mobilizing the necessary civilian infrastructure, transporting millions of tons of raw steel, relocating a specialized heavy industry workforce, and managing the complex, sprawling logistics across thousands of miles of contested ocean would logically take years. They assumed, with the hubris of a highly militarized society, that a massive, democratic, peacetime bureaucracy would inevitably stumble over its own administrative weight, bogged down by civilian contracts and political hesitation. The Japanese strategic timeline confidently projected that this inherent logistical friction would grant their armed forces at least a year and perhaps up to 18 months of rapid, unchecked expansion across the South Pacific and Southeast Asia before the American Navy could possibly muster a credible, organized, heavy counteroffensive. They severely, fundamentally underestimated the ruthless efficiency with which Admiral Nimitz and Captain Wallin seamlessly integrated civilian heavy contractors directly with Naval Command, systematically stripping away peacetime regulations and red tape to achieve immediate, massive industrial output right at the forward base. Yet, the Japanese calculation regarding the sheer speed of battleship recovery was, in one specific, critical aspect, entirely correct. The physical resurrection of the heavy armor was an agonizingly slow, methodical process, a reality best illustrated by the grueling, exhausting saga of the USS West Virginia. During the intense opening minutes of the attack, the West Virginia had absorbed catastrophic, overwhelming damage. She was struck by at least 7 aerial torpedoes that systematically tore open her port side and hit by two massive armor-piercing bombs that penetrated her decks. By all standard naval engineering metrics, she was structurally destroyed and functionally dead. However, rapid, disciplined counterflooding executed by her damage control crews during the chaos of the attack had prevented the massive dreadnought from completely capsizing. She had settled deep into the harbor mud, but she rested perfectly upright, her heavily damaged superstructure remaining above the waterline. This upright posture was her absolute salvation, and Valeen's salvage division immediately targeted the West Virginia as the prime candidate for the long-term recovery track. She became the ultimate, exhausting test of the underwater engineering war. For months on end, teams of divers practically lived inside her dark, toxic, flooded hull. They meticulously constructed the massive wooden cofferdams, pumped hundreds of tons of tremmy concrete directly over the gaping, jagged torpedo wounds, and constantly battled the lethal pockets of hydrogen sulfide gas as they slowly, continuously pumped the millions of gallons of seawater from her darkened compartments. It required half a year of relentless, unglamorous, highly dangerous, round-the-clock labor. Finally, on May 17, 1942, the combined power of the massive centrifugal pumps finally overcame the immense dead weight of the water. The USS West Virginia broke the powerful suction of the heavy harbor mud and slowly, heavily, refloated to the surface. But Nimitz, Wallen, and the engineers understood a brutal, unyielding reality that the American public, desperate for good news, often ignored. A refloated battleship is absolutely not a fighting battleship. The West Virginia was a hollowed-out, structurally compromised, gutted shell. Her complex electrical systems were completely ruined. Her massive steam engines were flooded with highly corrosive seawater. Her main battery was frozen, and her heavy armor belt was severely compromised. She had been saved from the suffocating mud, but her journey back to the war was only just beginning. She had to be carefully, delicately towed by tugboats into the massive concrete trench of Dry Dock No. 1, patched with temporary steel plating just enough to survive a hazardous ocean transit, and eventually sent thousands of miles back to the west coast to the Puget Sound Navy Yard for a total, multi-year, multi-million-dollar structural rebuild. The long-term track was functioning exactly as Nimitz had intended, proving the salvage was possible. But it confirmed the cold operational truth Tokyo relied upon. The heavy battleships were definitively out of the immediate fight, and the West Virginia would not fire her main guns in anger for a very long time. While the salvage crews wrestled with the dead steel in the mud of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz was aggressively executing the second, rapid track of his recovery strategy far over the distant horizon. He knew with absolute certainty he could not wait for the battleships to be raised and rebuilt. The Japanese expansion was moving far too fast, rapidly pushing south and threatening to sever the vital, irreplaceable logistical lifeline between the west coast of the United States and Australia. If that shipping line was cut, the entire South Pacific would fall, and the war would fundamentally change. The only operational shield the United States possessed to project power was its surviving, highly mobile aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the recently transferred Yorktown, which had rushed from the Atlantic. Nimitz ruthlessly threw these precious, vulnerable assets into the fight, utilizing them not as a traditional, slow-moving battle line, but as a fast, elusive, long-range striking force. Throughout the desperate early months of 1942, these carrier task forces executed a series of relentless hit-and-run raids against Japanese island perimeters deep in the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, Wake Island, and Marcus Island. Strategically, these strikes were mere pinpricks against the massive Japanese perimeter. They did not halt the overarching Japanese war machine, nor did they reclaim any significant lost territory. But operationally, tactically, and psychologically, they were absolutely vital to the survival of the fleet. They violently disrupted Japanese operational timetables, forced the enemy to divert critical resources to defend their expanding rear areas, and, most critically, they kept the American fleet operating at a high, aggressive combat tempo, forging a new doctrine of fast, mechanized warfare on the fly. However, this aggressive, relentless operational tempo exacted a brutal physical toll on the ships and the men. Warships pushed to their absolute mechanical limits in high-speed combat maneuvers, constantly launching and recovering heavy aircraft in rough seas while evading submarine threats, inevitably begin to physically break down. Heavy boilers require maintenance.
Wooden flight decks warp under the stress, and steel hulls fatigue. This is precisely where the true strategic value of the untouched infrastructure at Pearl Harbor paid its most immediate, decisive dividends. The rapid operational track was entirely, heavily dependent on the surviving logistics base.
When a carrier task force returned from a long raid, exhausted, low on fuel, and mechanically worn, the undamaged dry docks, the fully stocked, untouched tank farms, and the massive, sprawling machine shops instantly went into overdrive. The base executed rapid, continuous maintenance, pumping thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil into the ships, patching the structural wear and tear, repairing the aircraft, and turning the massive carriers around to send them immediately back out to the contested waters. It was a high-stakes, exhausting logistical marathon. Nimitz was performing a desperate, highly calculated balancing act, keeping the carriers deployed just long enough to strike and disrupt the enemy, but pulling them back to the intact infrastructure just in time to prevent total mechanical collapse. The entire American defense of the Pacific rested entirely on this fragile, continuous loop of combat, quick repair, and immediate redeployment, a loop sustained entirely by the very industrial facilities the Japanese strike force had purposefully ignored. This rapid, high-stress operational track was violently pushed to its absolute breaking point in May 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy High Command, deeply frustrated by the irritating American carrier raids and determined to finally sever the supply line to Australia once and for all, launched a massive, coordinated amphibious operation designed to capture the strategic prize of Port Moresby in New Guinea. Nimitz, utilizing rapidly evolving signals intelligence that pierced the fog of war, detected the massive thrust and immediately deployed his available fast carrier strength, the heavy fleet carriers Lexington and Yorktown, deep into the South Pacific to intercept the invasion force. The resulting clash was the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was a chaotic, unprecedented, and highly confusing engagement, marking the first naval battle in human history where the opposing surface ships never sighted each other, fought entirely by strike aircraft launching attacks over the horizon. The engagement severely, brutally tested the limits of American logistics, untested aviation doctrine, and desperate damage control. Tactically, it was a bloody, confused brawl characterized by errors on both sides. But strategically, the American aviators achieved their primary operational objective. The Japanese invasion force, having lost critical air cover, turned back. The seemingly unstoppable advance on Port Moresby was halted.
But the physical, material cost of executing this rapid track strategy was catastrophic. The United States Navy paid a devastating, irreplaceable price to hold the line in the South Pacific. The USS Lexington, one of the massive, central pillars of Nimitz's fast carrier force, absorbed multiple, heavy torpedo hits and devastating armor-piercing bombs. Despite frantic, heroic damage control efforts by her crew, internal aviation gasoline vapors leaked into the ship's ventilation system and ignited, triggering a series of uncontrollable, massive internal explosions that completely gutted the massive ship from the inside out. The Lexington had to be abandoned to the fire and scuttled by friendly torpedoes, resting forever at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The loss was a staggering, almost paralyzing blow to the already severely stretched Pacific Fleet, and the surviving American carrier did not escape the violence of the rapid track. The USS Yorktown sustained a direct hit from a massive Japanese armor-piercing bomb that punched straight through her wooden flight deck and detonated deep within her hull, tearing apart heavy steel bulkheads, destroying vital engineering compartments, and severely fracturing her internal structural integrity. As the heavy smoke finally cleared over the South Pacific, the American operational fleet found itself dangerously, perhaps fatally, degraded. The long-term salvage track back in Hawaii was still years away from providing any heavy surface reinforcements. The rapid track had just permanently lost a massive percentage of its offensive striking power in a single afternoon, and the Yorktown, trailing a long, dark slick of fuel oil, was limping heavily back toward the repair facilities of Pearl Harbor, structurally shattered, taking on water, and barely seaworthy. The timing of this severe operational attrition could not have been worse for Nimitz.
Far over the horizon, Japanese intelligence and naval planners were finalizing the complex details for an unprecedented, overwhelming offensive directed straight at the Central Pacific. A massive, multi-carrier thrust designed to draw out the remaining American carriers and finish exactly what the December 7th strike had started. And this massive new armada was already in motion. The target was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral guarding the approach to Hawaii. The Imperial Japanese Navy was sending a massive striking force built around 4 heavy fleet carriers.
Their objective was absolute: capture the atoll, draw out the remnants of the American fleet, and annihilate them. Admiral Nimitz knew they were coming. The breakthroughs of his cryptanalysts had pierced the fog of war. He knew the timetable, and he knew a brutal mathematical truth: he did not have the numbers to stop them. To spring a credible ambush, Nimitz desperately needed 3 flight decks. He only had 2 fully operational, Enterprise and Hornet. On the afternoon of May 27, 1942, the battered USS Yorktown dragged herself into the Pearl Harbor Channel. She immediately eased into dry dock number 1, the exact concrete trench spared by Japanese bombers 6 months prior. As the water pumped out, the full extent of the structural trauma was revealed. Navy Yard experts surveyed the ruptured internal bulkheads, twisted steel framing, and the massive crater punched through her flight deck. Their engineering assessment was mathematically sound and operationally devastating. To properly replace the fractured steel and return the carrier to a fully seaworthy condition required up to 3 months of intensive dry dock labor. Nimitz looked at the ticking clock of the Japanese advance. He did not have 3 months. He had barely 3 days. The admiral issued a ruthless operational mandate. He did not demand a perfect ship. He demanded a functional flight deck and a hull capable of floating long enough to fight. Standard regulations and peacetime safety margins were instantly discarded. What followed demonstrated the sheer industrial leverage that had survived the December attack. A massive swarm of civilian contractors, welders, and electricians flooded the carrier. The base diverted power to flood the dry dock with high-intensity light. For 72 continuous hours, the ship became an ear-splitting cavern of grinding steel and blinding welding arcs. Workers did not carefully replace shattered internal bulkheads. They rapidly braced them with heavy steel I-beams, welding them straight across the fractures to keep the hull from collapsing. The bomb hole in the flight deck was hurriedly patched with fresh timber, leveling the surface just enough for a fully loaded dive bomber to accelerate over it without tearing off its landing gear. The repairs were rough and deeply imperfect, but they met the Admiral's singular requirement. On the morning of May 30th, exactly 3 days after she limped in, the dry dock flooded. The Yorktown, still bearing the internal scars of the Coral Sea, steamed out of the channel. Civilian welders were still aboard, frantically finishing electrical patches as she headed for the open ocean. She was not fully healed, but she was armed and moving. Nimitz had scraped together his 3rd flight deck, sending a damaged ship out to carry the entire strategic weight of the Pacific War into a desperate ambush. She sailed north into the vast Pacific to rendezvous with the Enterprise and the Hornet at a highly classified coordinate known as Point Luck. The hurriedly repaired carrier was not sailing into a minor skirmish. She was steaming directly toward the most consequential naval engagement of the 20th century. The Japanese striking force arrived at Midway Atoll exactly when and where American cryptanalysts had predicted. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's battle plan relied entirely on drawing out what he believed was a desperately outmatched American remnant. Based on their own battle damage assessments, Japanese intelligence confidently concluded that the Yorktown had been destroyed at the Coral Sea, or at the very least was languishing in a mainland dry dock for months of mandatory repairs. When the Japanese commanders looked out over the ocean on the morning of June 4, 1942, they expected to overwhelm a fragile 2-carrier defense with a massive 4-carrier armada. Radio intelligence provided Nimitz with the map of the Japanese advance, but intelligence alone cannot sink a ship. A decrypted message cannot launch a dive bomber, and a warning cannot defend an atoll. It was the physical reality of the Yorktown's presence that transformed the intercept from a warning into an execution. Because the sprawling repair yards of Pearl Harbor had functioned exactly as they were built to, Nimitz was able to field 3 flight decks against the Japanese 4. That single, frantically patched carrier narrowed the numerical gap just enough to make a massive counterstrike survivable. The resulting clash shattered the offensive power of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In a matter of hours, American dive bombers decimated the enemy's elite carrier striking force. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, the very same massive fleet carriers that had launched the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were systematically reduced to burning, sinking wrecks. The strategic balance of power in the Pacific shifted violently and permanently in a single afternoon. Japan lost its 4 primary fleet carriers. It lost hundreds of highly trained veteran aviators, and it permanently lost the initiative to dictate the terms of the war. The United States did not escape the ambush unscathed. The USS Yorktown, already structurally compromised from her previous battles, absorbed punishing enemy counterattacks. Despite another desperate display of damage control by her exhausted crew, she eventually succumbed to a Japanese submarine torpedo and slipped beneath the waves. But she had done exactly what was required. She had absorbed enemy strikes, launched critical attack squadrons, and fundamentally altered the mathematics of the battle. Her sacrifice validated Nimitz's ruthless operational triage. A severely damaged ship had dictated the outcome of a critical operation, specifically because Pearl Harbor remained a functioning system of rapid recovery.
The victory at Midway effectively closed Nimitz's urgent, rapid response track. The American carriers had successfully held the line, permanently neutralizing the immediate threat of unchecked Japanese naval expansion. The vital shipping lanes to Australia were secure, but this tactical triumph, bought with the lives of aviators and the final loss of the Yorktown, was only the first half of the monumental task Nimitz had inherited. With the fast carriers having stabilized the Pacific board state, the strategic focus could now slowly pivot back to the massive, grinding industrial effort still unfolding in the dark waters of Hawaii. Behind the protective shield forged at Midway, the long-term salvage track continued its exhausting work without the paralyzing threat of a second Japanese strike. The colossal shipyards on the American West Coast were preparing dry docks to receive the shattered hulks that Captain Wallen's divers were still wrestling from the mud. The fast carriers had saved the fleet in 1942, but the grueling war of attrition looming over the next 3 years would require the heavy artillery and massive armored platforms that the Japanese believed they had permanently buried on December 7th. The resurrection of that heavy armor finally culminated more than 2 years after the last fires had been extinguished in Hawaii. By the fall of 1944, the agonizing, unglamorous industrial slog initiated by Admiral Nimitz and executed by Captain Wallen finally delivered its heavy dividends. On the night of October 24, 1944, deep in the Philippine archipelago, an American naval task force formed a rigid battle line across the dark, narrow waters of the Surigao Strait. They were there to protect the massive amphibious invasion of Leyte from a Japanese southern counterthrust. Waiting in the pitch blackness of that strait was the USS West Virginia. She was virtually unrecognizable from the gutted, oil-soaked hulk that divers had wrestled from the Pearl Harbor mud. After surviving the toxic salvage operation and the long tow across the Pacific, mainland shipyards had completely dismantled and rebuilt her. Now she was wider, heavily fortified against air attack, and bristling with advanced fire control radar that allowed her main guns to acquire targets in total darkness. When the Japanese surface fleet pushed into the strait in the early hours of October 25th, the West Virginia did not fight alone. Arrayed alongside her in the dark were the Tennessee, the California, the Maryland, and the Pennsylvania. Nearly the entire American battle line waiting to crush the Japanese advance that night consisted of resurrected veterans of Battleship Row. When the West Virginia's massive 16-inch guns unleashed devastating broadsides into the darkness, guided entirely by radar, it was the definitive, violent closure of the long-term salvage track. The Japanese military planners who drafted the December 7th strike had gambled the fate of their empire on a rigid, static assumption. They believed that sinking a battleship equated to erasing American naval power. They inflicted horrific, undeniable human and material damage, killing thousands and temporarily removing the heavy surface fleet from the board. But in their singular obsession with the warships, they left the circulatory system of the United States Navy entirely untouched. By ignoring the millions of barrels of heavy fuel oil, bypassing the massive dry docks, and sparing the sprawling machine shops, they provided Nimitz with the exact industrial weapons required to engineer his dual-track recovery. The survival of that infrastructure allowed a crippled Yorktown to be thrust back into the decisive ambush at Midway in just 3 days, holding the line when the Pacific hung in the balance. And it allowed a completely submerged dreadnought like the West Virginia to be dragged from the abyss, completely modernized, and returned to the vanguard of the fleet. The true failure of the Pearl Harbor attack was not just missing the aircraft carriers. It was the fundamental failure to understand that American naval power was not merely a collection of anchored steel hulls. It was a dynamic, highly adaptable collective system. By leaving the repair infrastructure intact, Tokyo did not destroy the United States Pacific Fleet. They merely forced it to evolve, handing it the time and the tools
to resurrect itself into a mechanized force they could never hope to outpace. Japan calculated that plunging the heavy battleships into the mud of Pearl Harbor would permanently kill the Pacific Fleet, betting the entire expansion of their empire on the rigid, fatal assumption that sunken steel inherently meant a broken navy.
But on the morning of December 7th, the Imperial Japanese Navy committed a profound strategic oversight by only breaking the immediate weapons of war, while completely bypassing the vast, irreplaceable industrial forge required to sustain them. By ignoring the empty dry docks, the millions of barrels of heavy fuel oil, and the sprawling machine shops, they left behind the exact anvil upon which Admiral Nimitz and an exhausted army of engineers hammered a shattered fleet into a modernized maritime weapon, ultimately proving that the very harbor Japan intended to be America's naval graveyard was actually the forge that built the machinery of their total defeat.